I was sitting in my dorm room when my phone rang. Seeing my dad's name on the screen, I smiled. He usually called on Sundays, but today was Wednesday. "Hi, Dad," I said. "Letitia, sweetheart." His voice sounded different, tense. I tensed up immediately. Dad wasn't one for theatrics, and his tone made me grip my phone tighter. "I need to talk to you about something serious. Can you come home?" My heart skipped a beat. What happened? "We should talk in person. Please." I glanced at my calendar. Midterms were approaching, and every minute was scheduled weeks in advance. "I can come in 2 weeks. Is that okay?" "Yes, it's fine." He paused briefly, then added, "I love you, Letitia." Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I could barely focus on my studies. My thoughts kept drifting back to Dad's call, to his voice that sounded wrong. What could be so important that he was asking me to come home? The train ride to my hometown felt endless. I watched out the window as familiar landscapes passed by one after another. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. When I finally arrived home, Beatrice opened the door. "Letitia." Her face was tense, and her voice was quieter than usual. The next moment, she pulled me into a hug. It caught me off guard. My stepmother wasn't the kind of woman to show affection so openly. "He's in the study," she said softly, leading me down the hallway. The moment I saw my dad, my blood ran cold. He was sitting at his massive oak desk, but he looked small. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, and his face had taken on an ashen tone. "Letitia," he smiled weakly. "Come here, sweetheart." I rushed to him, hugging him, trying not to show how much his frailty shook me. "Dad, what's going on?" He gestured for me to sit. Took a deep breath. "The doctors found cancer, sweetheart. It's an advanced form. He swallowed. They don't think I have much time left." The room started spinning. I felt Beatrice's arms wrap around me as I struggled to breathe. "I'm so sorry," Dad whispered. "I hope you'll visit me. I want to spend as much time with you as I can." We spent the weekend together. Dad barely touched his food, but he talked more than ever. He reminisced about my childhood, my first steps, my first word, the time I tried to dye our cat purple. And he talked about Mom. "Your mother was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen," he said, his gaze distant. "The day she walked into that cafe, I spilled coffee on myself just staring at her." Beatrice silently stood up and left the room, giving us space. Dad's voice grew softer as he spoke about Mom, about how she had fought her illness until the very end. How brave she had been. I remembered her, but the memories had blurred over the years. And now, listening to Dad, I could almost feel her presence, as if she were here again. After that weekend, everything changed. I started calling Dad every day between classes and taking the train home every weekend instead of once a month. With each call, his voice grew weaker, but he always perked up when I told him about my life on campus. At first, Beatrice seemed supportive. She greeted me warmly, cooked meals, sometimes even sat with us during our conversations. But after a few weeks, something changed. The welcoming hugs disappeared. Instead of a warm, "How was your trip?" I was met with a curt nod. During dinners, she sat across from me, pushing food around her plate absent-mindedly, barely speaking. "How are your classes, Letitia?" Dad tried to ease the tension. "They're good," I said, glancing at Beatrice. Her jaw was clenched. "I got an A on my psychology paper." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Dad tried to clap his hands, but they trembled. Beatrice stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor as she pushed it back, and she quickly left the room without even looking at us. I stood in the doorway of my former room, unable to believe my eyes. Everything here made it clear that my presence in this house was no longer expected. Arabella had obviously decided that this space was now hers, and no one had even bothered to warn me. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the sudden wave of anger. My breathing slowed, but the lump in my throat didn't go away. I stepped inside, running my fingers over the unfamiliar dresser, where makeup brushes, expensive perfume bottles, and a gold chain with a pendant in the shape of an were scattered. Everything here was soaked in her presence. My things. Where were my things? I spun around sharply, walked into the hallway, and headed downstairs, where laughter was still echoing. As soon as I entered the kitchen, the conversation fell silent. Beatrice sat at the table, her arms crossed. Arabella, her perfectly styled blonde hair gleaming, lazily sipped her tea, while Durant, legs sprawled out, scrolled through something on his phone. "Where are my things?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Beatrice blinked, as if only now noticing me. "What do you mean?" I clenched my teeth. "My things are gone from my room." "Oh," Arabella's voice was light, almost mocking. "We packed them into boxes." I felt something collapse inside me. "Into boxes," I repeated, staring at her. She shrugged. "Dad said you didn't need to live here anymore. And since I needed a room." I turned to my father. He looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected such a reaction. "Letitia, sweetheart," he lifted a hand, trying to calm me. "I thought that you." "You thought what?" I stepped closer, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Dad sighed, rubbing his face tiredly. "You live on campus anyway. It just seemed like the practical thing to do." The practical thing to do. I felt a fresh surge of anger rise within me. "Where are my things?" My voice was firm, icy. In the garage, Beatrice stood up, as if putting an end to the conversation. "If you need them, you can take them." My fingers trembled as I clenched them into fists. "Great," I muttered through gritted teeth. I turned and left. The garage was cold and dusty. Among old tools, boxes of Christmas decorations, and discarded junk, 3 large cardboard boxes sat stacked. I sank to my knees and opened the first one. My books were thrown in haphazardly, some with bent covers. The second box was filled with clothes, crumpled and shoved inside without care. The third held my journals, personal notes, photographs. Like trash. I sat on the floor, staring at it all, feeling tears welling up and slipping down my cheeks. This wasn't just an action. It was a message. You are no longer a part of this home. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to contain the storm of emotions rising inside me. A deep breath in, a slow breath out. I wouldn't let them see how much this broke me. A noise came from the doorway. I lifted my head and saw my father. He stood leaning against the doorframe, his face weary, but his eyes filled with pain. "Letitia," his voice was quiet. I didn't answer. "I didn't want it to happen like this." He took a step forward. "It's just, everything is so complicated." I looked at him. "Complicated?" I repeated, feeling fresh anger ignite inside me. "I'm sick, Letitia," he whispered. I shot to my feet. "Yes, Dad, you're sick. That's why I'm here. That's why I come every weekend." "And them?" I gestured toward the house. "Where have they been all this time?" He looked away. "They're my family too." Family. I swallowed hard, feeling something inside me hollow out. "All right," I said. "I'll take my things and won't bother you anymore." I grabbed the first box and headed for the door. Dad didn't stop me. The door finally opened, and Beatrice appeared on the threshold. She was dressed in a perfectly pressed cream blouse and dark trousers, her hair flawlessly styled, but her eyes. There wasn't a trace of warmth in them. "Oh, you're back," she said, crossing her arms over her chest, as if I were an unwelcome guest rather than the daughter of the man lying in this house, dying. "Where's Dad?" I tried to step inside, but she didn't move, blocking my way. "He's sleeping," she replied curtly. I felt my fingers curl into fists. "Why didn't you call me?" Beatrice sighed, shaking her head like I was an annoying child asking too many questions. "Letitia, your father is very weak. We didn't want to worry you too soon." "That's not your decision to make." My voice trembled with barely restrained anger. Footsteps sounded behind her, and a second later, Aunt Sarah appeared. Her face was tense, her eyes red as if she had just been crying. "Let her in, Beatrice," she said quietly but firmly. Beatrice pressed her lips into a thin line but stepped aside. I rushed inside without even looking at her and ran upstairs to my father's room. The door was slightly open, and inside, I saw him. He was lying on the bed, propped up by pillows. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, his cheekbones were sharp, and his hands, once strong, now seemed so fragile, as if they could break at the slightest movement. "Dad," I whispered, stepping closer. His eyelids fluttered, and he slowly opened his eyes. When he saw me, a faint smile lit up his face. "Letitia, my girl," his voice was weak, but I could hear the genuine happiness in it. I sat beside him, carefully taking his hand. "I'm here, Dad," I said, struggling to hold back my tears. "You got here so fast," he attempted a small smile. "Of course, I did. As soon as I found out, I came straight away." His eyes darkened, something like worry flickering in them. "Who told you?" "Aunt Sarah." For a moment, irritation flashed across his face, but then he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I wanted you to be here," he whispered. I clenched my teeth, feeling another wave of anger rise inside me. "I would have come sooner if I had known," I said, looking at him, but his eyes were already closing again. His strength was fading too fast. I spent the rest of the day by his side, holding his hand and listening to his quiet, barely audible voice. He spoke about the past, about Mom, about our home, about how he used to love walking along the river when he was young. I absorbed every word, holding on to them like they were the last thread connecting me to him. By evening, he fell asleep, and I finally stepped out of the room, feeling drained. Aunt Sarah was waiting for me in the hallway. "We need to talk, Letitia," her voice was serious. I nodded, and we walked to the kitchen. To my surprise, Arabella was already there. She looked pleased, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against a porcelain teacup. "It's good that you came," she said with a smirk. "What do you mean?" I frowned. "Oh, we've already decided everything." Her tone was light, but something unpleasant gleamed in her eyes. I turned to Aunt Sarah. "What is she talking about?" "They want you to leave, Letitia," Aunt Sarah said, her voice shaking with outrage. "They say your father is too weak for stress, and that you're upsetting him." "Upsetting him?" I shot to my feet. Beatrice entered the kitchen, folding her arms across her chest. "We're only thinking about your father's well-being, Letitia. He needs to rest, and your constant arguments with us aren't helping anything." "He is my father," I said, barely containing my anger. "Yes, but you're his daughter, and I'm his wife." Her voice was icy. "I know better what's important for him." I clenched my teeth, my chest rising and falling heavily. "You just want to get rid of me," I hissed. Arabella smiled. "We would all be much more at peace if you went back to your university and let Dad rest." I looked at her, then at Beatrice. "You're just waiting for him to die, aren't you?" Beatrice straightened abruptly. "How dare you?" I dare because I see what's happening. My voice shook as I took a step forward. You moved in here, you took over my home, my room, and now you want to push me out completely. Don't be ridiculous, Beatrice snapped. I was breathing hard. They were getting what they wanted. They wanted me gone. But I wasn't going to give up. Beatrice stood there in her silk robe, looking at me as if I were some uninvited guest who had rudely interrupted her peaceful evening. What are you doing here? Her voice was cold, detached. I didn't answer. Instead, I pushed past her into the house, feeling my heart pounding. I took a leave of absence from university, I said, dropping my bag onto the floor. I'm coming home to be with Dad. Beatrice calmly closed the door behind me and turned around. Her expression remained indifferent, but there was something like bored contempt in her eyes. Don't worry, she said, crossing her arms. He was taken to the hospital 2 days ago. He's on life support. The world seemed to shrink around me. What? My voice came out raw. You should go back to college, she continued with a shrug. Focus on your studies. There's nothing you can do for him now anyway. I straightened, lifting my chin. I have every right to be here. This is my home too. Beatrice tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a smug smile. Don't worry, dear. It won't be for long. I didn't bother to find out what exactly she meant. Turning away, I grabbed my bag and ran upstairs, tossing my belongings into the tiny guest room that had now been assigned to me. Then, without wasting another second, I rushed back out of the house and headed straight for the hospital. The intensive care unit was bathed in sterile white light. My father lay on the bed, wires and tubes wrapped around him. The monitor tracked his heartbeat, while the machines hummed softly, filling the room with an endless, unsettling rhythm. I stepped closer, sinking into the chair beside his bed. His face was pale, lifeless, almost blending in with the white sheets. I reached out carefully and touched his hand. It was cold. Miss Matthews? I flinched and turned around. A doctor in a white coat stood before me, a middle-aged man with tired but kind eyes. I'm Dr. Cassoni, he introduced himself, crouching slightly beside me. I've been overseeing your father's condition. How is he? My voice trembled. The doctor let out a heavy sigh. I need to be honest with you. The cancer has spread aggressively. Chemotherapy is no longer working. I tightened my grip on my father's cold hand. You should prepare for the worst, the doctor added, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. I nodded, unable to speak. I spent the rest of the day sitting by my father's side, talking to him about everything that came to mind, about college, my friends, my latest paper that had earned top marks. I didn't know if he could hear me, but it was important to me to fill the silence. When it was time to leave, I didn't want to go. But I had to return home, though that house no longer felt like home. When I walked into the living room, Beatrice, Arabella, and Durant were sitting there watching TV. Not one of them even looked at me. Arabella, on the other hand, stretched lazily and turned up the volume. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, feeling transparent, invisible. Then, without a word, I headed upstairs. The following days blurred into an endless, gray stream. In the mornings, I went to the hospital and sat by my father's bedside while the doctors ran their tests. In the evenings, I returned to a house full of people who treated me as if I didn't exist. They spoke around me, but never to me. They ate at the table, but never set a place for me. They closed doors right in front of me. One afternoon, I came back earlier than usual. The doctors were running some tests and had asked me to leave for a couple of hours. I had just stepped inside when I heard Beatrice's voice. She was on the phone. Yes, I want a full renovation. Her tone was light, businesslike. I froze in the kitchen doorway, unable to believe my ears. A complete remodel of the kitchen, tear down the wall between the living room and dining area. New floors, of course. It needs to be done as soon as possible. I couldn't believe it. You're seriously planning a renovation right now? My voice cut through the air like a knife. Beatrice fell silent instantly and turned to me with mild irritation, as if I had interrupted something important. Life goes on, Letitia, she said calmly, pressing the button to end the call. We can't spend forever dwelling on. On what? I took a step closer. On my father? On the fact that he's dying? She crossed her arms, her gaze turning cold and sharp. Doesn't this house need an update? I stared at her, feeling anger build inside me, but even worse was the realization. You really believe this house will be yours when Dad... I couldn't finish the sentence. Beatrice raised an eyebrow slightly. Not yet, but soon enough. I froze. She already saw herself as the owner of this house. She was already deciding what to remodel, as if my father were just an obstacle that would soon be gone. I stood there, staring at her, until the full weight of her words sank in. Without another word, I turned and walked away to my room. Only when the door closed behind me did I allow myself to cry. I sat up straighter in my chair, watching Beatrice, who was still trying to maintain her composure, though her hands were gripping the hem of her expensive black dress with a tense, almost desperate force. The will can't be complete without mention of the house. Her voice trembled, but she was trying to keep it steady, as if hoping the lawyer had simply forgotten to mention the most important part. This must be some kind of mistake. Mr. Patterson didn't rush to respond. He lifted his tired gaze over his glasses and carefully stacked the papers in front of him. There is no mistake, Mrs. Matthews, he said calmly. This house never belonged to your husband, and therefore, it could not be included in the will. A ringing silence filled the room. I saw Arabella and Durrant exchange confused glances before turning their eyes to their mother. Beatrice, however, sat frozen, her lips slightly parted, as if the words had gotten stuck in her throat. Excuse me, what? She finally hissed. Mr. Patterson paused, as if savoring the moment, then continued. The house belonged to your late wife. And after her passing, ownership was transferred to her daughter, Miss Letitia. I felt a faint, almost imperceptible smile form on my lips. No, that's impossible. Beatrice was losing control, her face turning red with rage. This is my husband's house. He lived here. That's correct, the lawyer nodded slightly. But he only lived here as Letitia's guardian until she reached legal adulthood. The house was never his property. I watched as Beatrice's fingers dug into the armrest of the sofa, her nails pressing hard into the fabric. But all she could say was, You're lying. I'm afraid that's simply a fact, Mr. Patterson replied smoothly, shrugging his shoulders. Beatrice swallowed hard. I could see her world crumbling. For years, she had considered this house hers. She had made plans, dreamed of renovations, had probably already pictured herself as the mistress of the place, reshaping every corner to her liking. This is impossible, she repeated, quieter now, but the confidence in her voice was gone. I leaned forward, feeling a warm wave of satisfaction spread through me. I think it's time for you to start packing, I said, echoing the very words she had told me after my father's funeral. Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with fury. I'm not leaving. You can't stay, I said calmly. This is my house. But we were a family. Her voice shook as she turned to Arabella and Durrant, as if looking for support. But her children sat frozen, the realization dawning on them that their mother had deceived them. They had truly believed this house was theirs. That they had nothing to worry about, that their future here was secure. Mom, did you know about this? Arabella asked quietly, her perfect posture faltering. Of course not. Beatrice snapped. If I had known. She trailed off. If she had known, then what? My smile widened. Well, I said, rising slowly. I think you should start packing. I'll take you to court, she shouted, jumping to her feet. You can try, I shrugged. But you don't stand a chance. Beatrice let out a furious breath, her hands curling into fists. You'll regret this, Letitia, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. I leaned in, meeting her gaze head-on. I already regret letting you live here for so long. Turning on my heel, I walked out of the living room, leaving her, Arabella, and Durant in stunned silence. They hadn't just lost. They had never even been in the game. Beatrice slowly turned, her chest rising and falling heavily, her fingers still gripping the edge of the curtain rod. Chaos flickered in her eyes, a mix of anger, desperation, and the bitter realization that her little charade had failed. You don't understand, her voice broke into a hysterical laugh. This is my home. I've spent years on it. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a tall man with a square jaw and tired eyes, pulled out a notepad. Ma'am, we have a formal complaint from the legal owner of the house regarding intentional property damage, he said, nodding in my direction. I suggest you calm down. I put my heart into this place. Beatrice shrieked, her voice stretched thin like a fraying thread. This house belongs to me. It never did, I said clearly, crossing my arms. You knew that. But it was convenient to pretend otherwise. Arabella and Durant stood frozen in the doorway. Their faces no longer held any certainty. Even Arabella, who always played the role of the entitled heiress, now looked like she had suddenly found herself on the wrong side of things. This is all a mistake, Beatrice croaked. The officer looked at her with mild sympathy, but his tone held no doubt. You need to stop resisting, ma'am. Or what? She sneered, her lips twisting into a grimace. Or we'll press charges. That did it. Beatrice slowly loosened her grip, letting the curtain rod drop to the floor with a dull thud. The room sank into tense silence. With every beat of my heart, I felt relief growing inside me. You need to leave the house, the second officer said firmly. Right now. We have 2 weeks. Arabella shrieked, her voice breaking into a desperate screech. You had 2 weeks, I met her gaze. But after today, you're leaving immediately. Beatrice gritted her teeth, her fists tightening at her sides. You'll pay for this, Letitia. I tilted my head, feeling a cold smile spread across my lips. No, Beatrice. You will. The pair of officers stepped out of the house, giving them time to gather their things. I didn't stay to watch. Instead, I went upstairs, closed the door behind me, and leaned against it. The house was mine. It always had been. But for the first time in years, I truly felt it. After everything that had happened, the house felt different. Even in its ruined state, with torn wallpaper, overturned furniture, and bare walls, it finally belonged to me completely. Not just on paper, but in every way that mattered. I ran my fingers along the wooden staircase railing, remembering how I used to slide down it as a child when Mom wasn't looking. The kitchen still carried traces of cinnamon and vanilla, the lingering echoes of her baking, a scent that always twisted my stomach with nostalgia. This house was filled with memories, but now, without Beatrice's presence, it no longer felt like a prison. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of freedom, and picked up my phone to call Aunt Sarah one more time. It's done. The house is mine, I said as soon as she answered. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, she replied warmly. I knew you'd handle it. I'll feel a little more at peace once the renovations are finished, I admitted. Right now, It looks like a battlefield after a failed storm named Beatrice. Aunt Sarah chuckled softly. Don't worry about that. I'll keep an eye on the house and the contractors. By the time you come back, it'll be as good as new. I closed my eyes, grateful to have at least one person I could trust. Thank you, Aunt Sarah. You can always count on me, Letitia. I ended the call and glanced around the rooms once more. Yes, the repairs would take time. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't have to worry about anyone else laying claim to what was rightfully mine. The next morning, I left the house, handing the keys to Aunt Sarah and giving final instructions to the contractors. The train station was bathed in soft morning light, the air crisp with the scent of autumn. And as the train pulled away, I felt a wave of relief. There was no reason to stay any longer. I returned to college, throwing myself into my studies, making up for lost time. Lectures, essays, research papers, all of it became my focus. I let myself fall into the rhythm, pushing away thoughts of everything I had been through. All I had to do was wait for the renovations to be finished. A few weeks later, Aunt Sarah sent me photos. The house had transformed. There were no traces of Beatrice's tantrums, no thrown objects, no ripped wallpaper. The walls had been repainted, the old wooden floors polished to a shine. Even the library, where my stepmother had once raged, now looked almost the way it had when my mother was alive. I looked at the pictures and felt a small smile tug at my lips. It was mine again. Soon after, I found the perfect tenants, an elderly couple who loved warm, old houses. They didn't want to remodel anything or change it to fit their style. They simply wanted to live there, to care for the house rather than destroy it. When I signed the lease, I felt something click into place inside me. The house was safe. I never heard from Beatrice, Arabella, or Durand again. No calls, no letters, no attempts to reach out. Maybe they moved to another city. Maybe they just continued their lives somewhere else. And that was perfectly fine with me. Sometimes, in rare moments of weakness, I wondered, what if things had been different? What if they had treated me as family instead of an inconvenience? What if Beatrice had truly loved my father and not just the comfort of a status? What if Arabella and Durant had accepted me as a sister instead of looking down on me? But those thoughts never lingered for long. The past would remain the past. And my future was mine alone. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. See you soon.